Let's get some more details on this now. I'm joined live by Dr. Ibrahim Alloush, a professor at Zaytouneh University in Jordan. Thank you for coming on RT today. The U.S. is looking for ways to help the Syrian people, but Barack Obama said America is not going to arm the opposition. Do you think a helping hand offering weapons could be extended by other countries, Gulf states, for example?
Well, I think that it is pretty clear that the rebels have been receiving arms from abroad. And Syrian television has been showing almost daily shipments of arms being smuggled into Syria via Lebanon, Turkey, and other border crossings. So where are these weapons coming from? These weapons are coming from all over the place. And since the rebels are being supported by the GCC and by NATO, it is safe to assume that they are getting their financing and their weaponry from the same sources that are offering them political cover and financial backing.
So, as you're saying, if weapons really are indeed coming in across the border from Lebanon and Turkey, then those behind these weapons shipments, what are their motives here? Are they striving for the Assad regime to be toppled? If so, how can they benefit?
Well, I think after so many months of military operations by the rebels in Syria, it is pretty clear that what we are dealing with here is definitely not a peaceful protest, but an armed rebellion supported from abroad by the same powers that invaded Iraq and Libya. So basically what we are dealing with here is an armed rebellion that does not express the will of the Syrian people. We are dealing with a Western military, political and security infiltration into Syria. And what was mentioned a little while ago from New York, it is exactly the case. When the Syrian army withdrew from any town or city, it was taken over by armed rebels. We did not see massive demonstrations in the neighborhoods or towns that the Syrian army pulled out of. On the contrary, what we saw was an armed infiltration by armed gangs that terrorized the people and wreaked havoc on the area. So, of course, what they want to do is topple the Syrian regime. And why do they want to topple the Syrian regime? Do they stand for freedom or democracy as they claim? On the contrary, what they want is to have a puppet regime in Damascus that would obey the dictates of Washington and the NATO. Let me just add very quickly that the Syrian opposition so far has been refusing vehemently to speak to the Syrian government. So it is not the Syrian government that has been refusing to speak to the opposition. On the contrary, the Syrian government has been calling for dialogue over and over again for the last few months. But we have seen that all kinds of opposition in Syria.
If I may just jump in for a moment, I do apologise for interrupting you here. But if you, as you say, the opposition has been reluctant, if not defiant, in joining with the opposition not coming to the negotiating table with the government. But as we know, Moscow has been trying to bring both sides to the negotiating table. In theory, both sides said, well, hypothetically, that might work. Do you think, is it possible that both sides could come together and talk to resolve this bloody crisis?
I think that both Russia and China have created better conditions for the opposition to accept dialogue with the government. The veto is helping peace more than anything, because it is telling the foreign-backed opposition that it cannot count on a foreign intervention, as happened in Libya and Iraq, to topple the regime. And therefore, in fact, the veto is creating better conditions for the opposition to come to the negotiating table. And in that sense, the veto is fostering peace and helping put an end to the bloodshed in Syria. So I agree completely. The solution is dialogue, and at the same time, it is very important to focus the light on the armed operations of the Syrian opposition. And here, let me remind you that even the so-called peaceful opposition that is located within Syria, and I'm not talking about the Syrian National Council here, even those I've listened to some of their spokespersons agree and support the operations of the rebels. So what we have here is a full-scale insurgency, but it has military as well as political scales, and we have to pay attention to both scales, not just one of them.
So as you say, though, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but as you say, we have basically a rebel insurgency here. Many are calling it a civil war. Also, many saying that it's not just a domestic issue, but there are massive regional implications with external players. Dr. Ibrahim Alloush, I wish we had more time for this. Professor at Zaytouneh University in Jordan, thank you for joining us on RT today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.